haven't heard my son's name spoken out loud in 25 years. Esteban. It hit me like someone had yelled it right into my ear. I was standing in my little apartment kitchen, still wearing my library name tag, when this young girl, a complete stranger, spoke it. She had just rung the doorbell, and I had only opened the door a crack, asking what she wanted. "I'm Liana," she said, her voice small and shaky. "I'm Esteban's daughter." The world just stopped spinning. The air left my lungs in one long, painful rush. It was the name of the boy who stole every penny Antonio and I had saved, and in doing so, broke his father's heart and killed him. I was 67, and I'd spent half my life believing a truth that was as sharp and cold as glass, but now the past was suddenly on my doorstep. I looked into her eyes. And that's when the real shock hit. They were the exact deep hazel of my husband Antonio's eyes, staring back at me from a face I'd never seen. The truth I had built my life around for a quarter-century began to crack. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew I had to let her in. Before we continue, please take a moment to leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, and please hit the like button for me right now and subscribe to my channel. We're building a community of people who know it's never too late to heal and find the truth. Now, back to my story. I led her past my small living room to the kitchen table. This small counter space was the office for my current life. A neat, crowded mess of invoices, my calculator, and the red pen I used to find other people's mistakes. I swept my work into a pile, needing to clear the table, needing to clear my head, but nothing could clear the sudden, deafening noise of the past roaring back to life. I offered coffee. I didn't really want her to stay, but I needed something to do with my hands, which had started to tremble. She accepted with a simple nod and sat down, carefully placing her worn backpack on the floor. As I poured the coffee, a cheap blend I bought because it was all I could afford, she wrapped both hands around the mug. She looked tired, like she'd been traveling for days, and deeply sad, the kind of sadness that runs generations deep. When I finally sat down across from her, the silence was worse than any question she could have asked. "He died last month," she finally managed, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from the coffee, avoiding my eyes. I didn't need to ask who. I knew. The news, after all the years of silence and certainty, landed flat. I had already grieved for Esteban 2 decades ago, burying the 22-year-old version of him with Antonio in the restaurant we lost. You can't grieve someone twice. The pain just becomes a different, colder thing. "Pancreatic cancer," she continued, speaking to the window now. "He was sick for almost a year of knowing, of counting down." I felt a confusing mix of cold anger and a tiny, unwilling flicker of sorrow for the son who died far away. My voice came out sharper than I intended, laced with all the bitterness that had kept me alive. "What did he tell you? What things did he say about what happened, about why he left?" I leaned forward, the decades of stored-up anger finally finding a target. "What happened, Liana, is that your father emptied the safe we had saved for 18 years. Your grandfather, Antonio, walked into that office, saw it empty, and the shock of it took his life 3 days later." She flinched, the hazel eyes snapping up to meet mine, but this time she held my gaze. Instead of answering, she reached into her backpack and pulled out a small, heavy, silver key. She set it on the table between us, next to my calculator and that red pen. It was a standard key, the kind used for self-storage units. The number 247 was stamped on the side. "He made me promise to find you," she said quietly, her voice a low plea. "To give you this. Before he died in the hospital, he told me everything. He said you deserve to know the truth about why he left, about where he's been, and what he's been doing all these years." I stared at the key. It was so small, so ordinary, yet it felt like the entire weight of my past had been concentrated into that little piece of metal. It held the explanation for a quarter-century of poverty, grief, and the cold, grinding work that had aged me before my time. The answers I had spent half my life pretending I didn't care about were suddenly right there. My hand, which was now trembling again, reached out and closed around the key. The metal was cool and slick against my palm, surprisingly light, yet it carried the impossible weight of lost time. "It's a storage unit here in San Diego," Liana explained, her voice gaining a little more strength as she finally gave me something concrete. "He said everything is there." "Everything?" I repeated, the single word hoarse. "The money he took? Why he really left? All of it?" I hadn't seen my son, hadn't heard his voice, hadn't even known if he was alive. Now he was dead, and this girl, this beautiful, heartbroken stranger with Antonio's eyes, was here, holding the key to the only questions that still mattered. I turned the key over in my fingers. Truth. I wasn't sure I could even recognize it anymore, or if I was strong enough to face it. The truth wouldn't bring Antonio back. It wouldn't magically restore the years of working 3 miserable jobs, eating cheap food, or washing my clothes in the bathtub when the laundromat was too expensive. But Liana was waiting, her expression a mix of hope and sorrow, waiting for a grandmother she didn't know, to choose between the bitter comfort of her long-held resentment and the devastating possibility of a different reality. I closed my fist around the key until the jagged edges pressed into my skin. "Where is this storage unit?" Liana pulled out her phone, the small screen showing an address near Marina Boulevard, about 15 minutes from my apartment in Ocean Beach. I nodded, trying to focus on the directions, but my mind was already racing back to that spring morning, 25 years ago. I was 42 then. Antonio was 62, a giant of a man, working 6 days a week as the cook and heart of El Sabor de Antonio, our small Mexican restaurant near the old North Park Theater. It was our everything. The scent of carnitas, the loud music, the laughter. We had built it from nothing, 18 years of 7-day weeks, shared dreams, and shared exhaustion. Antonio, who grew up poor in Guadalajara, never trusted banks after his family lost everything years ago. "This I can see, Isadora," he'd always tell me, patting the heavy safe in the back office. "This I can touch. It's safe." I always worried about keeping so much cash, but his stubbornness was something I learned to live with. Every week, he'd put a little extra from the register into the safe, organized into envelopes. Over 15 years, it had reached the total, $250,000. The biggest envelope, the one that kept us going, was the building fund. We were finally close to buying the space and owning the restaurant outright. Antonio taught Esteban the combination on his 21st birthday, a solemn moment in the back office. "In case something happens to me, son," I remembered Antonio saying, "you need to be able to take care of your mother." Esteban had nodded, serious and focused, memorizing the numbers before throwing the scrap paper away. That final morning started normally. Antonio went to the office early to get cash for a big supplier delivery. I was in the kitchen, prepping vegetables, the radio playing familiar music. Then came the awful thud from the back. I found him on the floor. His face was twisted, gray, one hand clutching his chest. Behind him, the heavy safe door was wide open, and it was completely empty. I don't remember much after that, the 911 call, the sirens, the ambulance, holding his hand, the smell of disinfectant in the hospital waiting room. They kept him alive for 3 days, the machines doing the work his heart couldn't. The doctors were gentle, using words like catastrophic and irreversible damage. They were telling me he wasn't coming back. All the while, I kept calling Esteban's phone, voicemail. I went to his apartment. His clothes were there, the bed unmade, but Esteban was gone. His car, the battered pickup Antonio helped him buy, was gone from the parking lot. It looked like he'd left for work and simply vanished. The police came to the hospital on the 3rd day, their questions leading to the same terrible conclusion. Only 3 people knew the combination: Antonio, me, and Esteban. Antonio died that afternoon. When the machines went silent, the doctor said the time of death, and I signed papers I couldn't even focus on. The funeral was small. The ugly rumor, the son stole the savings and killed his father, was like a cloud hanging over everything. People stopped looking me in the eye. I had to sell the restaurant, my entire life, just to cover the hospital bills and funeral. I moved into this cheap apartment and started working whatever jobs I could find: housekeeping, retail, bookkeeping. The anger became a part of me, a permanent, heavy coat I couldn't take off. My son stole everything and ran. That was the absolute unchangeable truth, or so I believed. Liana's quiet voice brought me back to my kitchen table, to the cold coffee and the silver key. "Are you okay, Abuela Isadora?" she asked. I blinked, the key warming slightly in my sweating palm. "I spent 25 years thinking I knew exactly what my son did," I said, my voice rough. "Now you're telling me that I might be wrong." Liana looked down again. "I just know there's more to the story. He made sure I understood that before he died." I stood up, poured the cold coffee away, and turned back to face her. "Then let's go," I said, the key burning in my palm. "We'll go to the storage unit. If there's a truth to be known, let's get it over with." She grabbed her backpack, ready to follow, but I stopped at the door, the knob cold under my fingertips. I had to know. I turned to her, my voice low and firm. "Wait, before we go, I need to know about you, about him. Tell me about the last 25 years. She nodded slowly, and we returned to the table. The map and the key lay there, waiting. I needed to know who this man was that she called father, and who this girl was that held my husband's eyes. I needed to understand the shadow life he led before I unlocked the truth he had promised me. I sat back down, the cheap vinyl seat squeaking under me. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't hostile. It felt like a curtain being drawn back, revealing a new stage. "Tell me about yourself, Liana, I insisted, my voice softer now, my attention fully on her. "Tell me about Esteban." She took a deep breath, resting her folded hands on the table. "I grew up in Tijuana, just across the border," she began, the American location of San Diego blurring into the Mexican city. "It was just me and him, a small apartment near Zona Rio. My mother left when I was 3. She went back to her family in Sinaloa. I don't remember her at all. It was always just the two of us." The picture she painted was one of quiet struggle. My son, the boy I remembered being easily charmed and a little spoiled, was raising a daughter alone in a foreign city. "What was he like?" I asked, the question escaping before I could stop it, tasting rough and dry on my tongue. Liana looked out the window, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "He was sad," she admitted. "He was always a little sad, but he was there, you know? Every morning he'd make me breakfast before work. Every night, no matter how tired he was, he'd help me with my homework." She paused. Then her eyes came back to mine, steady and clear. "He never missed a single school event, not one parent-teacher meeting. Even when he was completely exhausted, he was there." I tried to picture the man she described, a man dedicated and present. It didn't fit the image of the greedy, heartless thief who had shattered our lives. "What did he do for work?" I asked, needing to ground this shadow life in something real. "Construction," she answered. "Mostly commercial buildings. He'd come home covered in dust. His hands were always torn up and rough, but he never missed a day. Ever." Esteban, the boy who once complained about standing for too long in the restaurant, had spent his adult life doing back-breaking labor. He was 22 when he left, 47 when he died. That entire lost life was suddenly condensing onto my kitchen table. "Did he ever talk about us?" I asked, the single, most difficult question. "About me and his father?" She nodded. "Not often, but sometimes. He'd tell me stories about the restaurant, about learning to cook from your husband, my grandfather. He'd talk about you keeping the books, saying you could find a mistake just by looking at the page for a second." A sharp, aching twist ran through my chest. He remembered those things. He carried those memories, not just the money. "When I was maybe 10, Liana continued, her voice lower now, he showed me a photo from his wallet. It was of a woman, standing in front of the restaurant, smiling. He said, 'This is your grandmother, Isadora.' That was it, just your name. He never explained why I didn't know you." "And you asked?" I pressed. Of course I did, but he'd just get quiet, change the subject. I learned to stop asking. We sat in silence for a long moment, the unasked questions from a lonely little girl hanging heavy in the air. I looked at her, seeing Antonio's eyes and something else, a silent strength, an echo of my own survival instinct. What exactly did he tell you in the hospital? Hantardi, I asked, needing the story to move forward, to explain the key. Liana's face tightened with fresh pain. He got sick last year. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctor gave him 6 months. He made it 11. 11 months of dying. I couldn't help but wonder if he'd been scared, if he'd been in pain, if he'd thought about calling me. He kept working almost until the end, Liana continued, her focus turning inward as she recounted the memory. Didn't want to stop. Said he had things he needed to finish. The final week of his life, he was in the hospital. The morphine was so heavy he barely knew where he was. But one night, around 2 a.m, he woke up completely clear, she whispered. He grabbed my hand so hard it actually hurt. He said, I need to tell you everything before I can't anymore. And that's when he told her about me, about San Diego, and about a storage unit with a key he'd kept hidden all these years. He made her memorize the address and promised she would find me. Did he tell you why he left? I asked. The question flat, devoid of emotion, because I was already braced for a lie. Not really. Just that something terrible happened, that he had to leave, that he'd been carrying it, the reason all these years, and he needed you to know the truth. The truth. The word sounded impossible coming from the mouth of my own granddaughter. He had over 20 years to tell me the truth, I said, a bitter laugh catching in my throat. He said he couldn't, Liana countered, meeting my gaze with a sorrowful determination. He said he was too ashamed. That word hit me hard. Ashamed. He should have been ashamed. He emptied our safe and disappeared. His father died believing his own son had betrayed him. Liana leaned forward slightly. He died knowing that, Abuela, knowing what it did to his father. I think that guilt, carrying that, was part of what killed him too. It was like watching someone slowly drown. I looked out the kitchen window at the apartment building across the street, trying to find anything but the cold fire of my anger, but it was hard. How did you get here? I asked, changing the subject, needing a break from the emotional pressure. From Tijuana, 5 hours total, bus to the border, walked across, another bus from San Isidro. She studied her worn jacket, the frayed backpack, the deep exhaustion in her shoulders. She had traveled 5 hours, crossing a border, carrying the last message from her dead father to a grandmother she'd only seen in a photograph. A sudden decision settled over me, simple and undeniable. You can stay here tonight, I said. The couch pulls out into a bed. Her eyes widen slightly in surprise. You don't have to do that. I know I don't, I finished, feeling a strange warmth spread through me. But you came all this way, and your family, whether I like it or not. A flicker of genuine relief, of gratitude, washed over her face. Thank you, she whispered. I stood up, the key already tight in my hand. Let's go to the storage unit, I announced. If there's something I need to see, let's just get it over with. She grabbed her backpack, and this time I didn't hesitate. I turned the knob and stepped out, the small silver key leading the way to whatever truth my son had buried for 25 years. The old Honda coughed to life, protesting the sudden journey. I backed out of the parking spot in Ocean Beach and turned toward the industrial area near Marina Boulevard. Liana was silent in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the familiar San Diego streets that were entirely new to her. I kept my eyes on the road, the rhythmic hum of the engine the only sound, each turn of the wheel bringing us closer to a place I never knew existed, a secret hidden life I never wanted to confront. 15 minutes, the map on my phone said. 15 minutes to the great final reveal. The storage facility appeared on our right, a long flat building surrounded by a chain-link fence, rows of identical orange metal doors stretching out under the unforgiving California sun. It was the kind of anonymous place where people kept things they forgot, or things they desperately wanted to keep hidden. I pulled into the lot, the key in my pocket feeling heavier than its weight, and cut the engine. "Ready?" Liana asked, her voice small. I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. We walked into the small, air-conditioned office. The manager, a bored-looking man chewing gum, barely glanced up when I presented the key. He pushed a clipboard across the counter for a signature. Isadora Vega and Liana Vega. 2 names, separated by a lifetime of silence, signing side by side. He handed me a small map, Unit 247 circled in red marker. "Back corner," he mumbled, already back to his phone. "Lock it when you're done." We walked out into the heat. The rows of orange metal doors shimmered, identical and anonymous. The sun bounced off the concrete, making the air thick and hot. Unit 247 was at the very end, tucked into the darkest corner. I stopped in front of it, fitting the key into the lock. My hand was shaking, the metal slick with sweat. The lock clicked, and as I pulled the heavy door up, the metal screamed on its rails, a harsh grating sound that echoed down the long corridor. It rolled all the way up, revealing a space maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, dark and smelling faintly of dust, metal, and old cardboard. The dim corridor light barely reached inside. Against the back wall, sitting like a silent accusation, was a dark green safe. It was a medium-sized model, the exact same kind Antonio had kept in the back office of El Sabor de Antonio. I stopped dead, the irony hitting me like a physical blow. He had stolen from one safe only to hide everything in another one. "Is that?" Liana began, stepping in beside me. "The same kind," I finished, my voice thin and strange, "the same kind he emptied." Taped to the top of the safe was a piece of paper. Numbers were written on it in Esteban's familiar handwriting, 0715778. I recognized them immediately. July 15th, 1978, his birthday. Numbers I hadn't forgotten, though I wished I could. I reached for the dial, my hands shaking, but I needed to do this myself. Right to 07, left past 0 to 15, right to 78. The handle gave, and the door swung open with the metallic groan I hadn't heard in decades. Inside, the safe was filled with stacks of cash, held together by rubber bands. They weren't mixed up. They were organized. Each stack had a paper band with a year written in black marker. The first few stacks were dated right after he left, in the late 90s. Then they marched forward, the early 2000s, the teens, all the way to a stack marked just months ago. "Help me," I managed, the word a choked whisper. We pulled the stacks out together, setting them on the concrete floor. We didn't speak, just the rustle of old paper and the quiet snap of rubber bands as we organized them. 20s, 50s, hundreds. Liana pulled out her phone and opened the calculator. I counted out loud, stack after stack, year after year. Finally, Liana spoke, her voice awed. 356,000. I sat down on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by the physical proof. It was more than he'd taken, more than the $250,000 that had been in Antonio's safe. He had added to it. Year after year he had worked and saved and added more. "He paid it back," I choked out, the words broken by a sudden, unstoppable rush of tears. Every penny, and then some. I hadn't cried a real cry in years, but I couldn't stop it now. Hot tears of confusion, anger, and something I didn't have a name for. Liana sat down next to me, her presence a quiet support. When I could breathe again, I looked back into the safe. There was more inside, 3 cardboard boxes stacked behind where the money had been. "Help me with these," I said, the words barely audible. The final layers of the secret were about to be revealed. We pulled the 3 cardboard boxes out of the safe, stacking them neatly on the concrete floor next to the piles of cash. Esteban's careful handwriting labeled each one. Liana, records, and keepsakes. I picked up the first box, the one marked Liana, and lifted the lid. It was filled with hundreds of photographs. Liana as a baby, tiny and red-faced in a hospital blanket. Liana as a toddler with a gap-toothed smile clinging to a worn stuffed rabbit. School pictures year after year, kindergarten, 5th grade, high school. I pulled one out. Liana, maybe 7. Standing in front of a birthday cake. Esteban was behind her, his hands on her shoulders, both smiling, but his eyes, even then, looked heavy with a permanent sadness. I turned it over, his handwriting on the back, her 7th birthday. She asked about you today. I didn't know what to say. Another photo. Liana in a beautiful pink dress, Esteban beside her in a suit. On the back, her quinceañera. She's 15. She looks like you when you smile. I kept pulling photos out, my granddaughter's entire life documented moment by moment. Every birthday, every holiday, every ordinary moment, all captured, dated, and annotated by a father who loved her fiercely. First steps today. Lost her first tooth. Honor roll again. You'd be proud. Liana, now crying quietly beside me, was seeing her life through her father's eyes, seeing the quiet dedication with which he had saved every moment. The sheer volume of photos spoke to a man who lived his life with meticulous care, not a reckless thief. The care he'd never shown us, he had given completely to her. I pushed the photo box aside and opened the second one, marked Records. Inside were file folders labeled with years spanning over a decade. I didn't have the emotional strength to open them yet. My eyes were still blurred from the sight of the money in the photos. I moved to the third box, the one labeled Keepsakes. We lifted the lid together. Inside, nestled under a faded folded blanket, was a small wooden box, old and worn at the corners. I opened it slowly. Resting inside was a men's silver watch, the kind you wind, the face scratched, the band worn smooth. It had stopped working. Frozen at some random time. I picked it up, turning it over. The inscription on the back was worn but still readable. To Esteban, graduate, 1996. Love, Dad. Antonio had given him this watch when he graduated high school. I remembered the day, how proud Antonio had been, how long he had saved to buy it. Under the watch was a single folded photograph. It was the 3 of us, Antonio, me, and Esteban, standing in front of El Sabor de Antonio. I was younger, Antonio's arm around my waist, Esteban between us, grinning straight at the camera. We looked genuinely happy, a complete family. Tucked inside the fold was a tiny note, again in Esteban's handwriting. The watch was mine. Dad gave it to me when I graduated. I wore it every day, even after it stopped working. The photo was in my wallet. It's all I had left of you both. I held the watch in my palm. Esteban had worn this, carried this reminder of the father he was accused of killing into his 25-year exile. It was his only physical connection to the life he'd lost. At the very bottom of the safe, underneath where all the money stacks had been, was one final item, a thick, sealed envelope. My name, Rosa, was written across it in his careful, shaky handwriting. Liana saw me looking at it. He wrote that the week before he died, she said quietly. He made me promise to give it to you, said everything you need to know is in there. I picked up the envelope. It was slightly yellowed, the seal still intact. I could feel the thickness of the pages inside. This wasn't a note. It was a confession. The truth he had promised. The reason he'd left. The key to everything I was surrounded by. The money he had saved for decades. The photos of a granddaughter I'd never known. The watch he carried. Liana was watching me, waiting. I need to read this alone, I said, my voice steady now, but hollow. She nodded, understanding instantly. I understand. We packed everything back into the safe except the letter and one of the folders from the records box, which I impulsively grabbed. We locked the unit, the screaming metal door closing off the past. We walked back to the car in silence, the truth cradled in my hands, heavy and cold. I drove Liana to a hostel downtown, then went home. The sun was setting, painting my small kitchen in long orange shadows. I sat down at the table, the envelope in front of me, and prepared to face the final, most terrifying truth of all. The kitchen was dark, lit only by the last rays of sun slicing through the window. I had made tea, but it sat untouched. My eyes were fixed on the envelope. My name, Rosa, written across the front in my son's shaky hand. He had written this while he was dying, trying to clear his conscience before he ran out of time. I could picture him in that hospital bed, weak but determined. I finally reached out and broke the seal. Inside were 6 sheets of paper, written front and back. I started reading. Mom, I don't know how to start this. I've written it in my head 1,000 times, never found the right words, still haven't. But I'm dying, and I'm running out of time to be a coward. You think I stole from you and Dad? You're right, I did, but not for the reason you think. The spring of that year, my friend Carlos Ruiz came to me with a job. You remember Carlos from high school? He said he had side work, simple deliveries, paid in cash, $2,000 for one night. I wanted a car. I was tired of borrowing Dad's truck. I wanted to pay for it myself, not ask you both for help. You'd worked so hard already. Carlos swore it was easy, just packages from San Diego to Tijuana. He'd done it before. I should have asked what was in the packages. I should have questioned why someone pays $2,000 for a simple delivery, but I wanted that car, and I didn't ask. We picked up the package on a Wednesday night, a heavy box, taped shut. We drove toward the border but stopped at a gas station off the 805. I went inside for a bottle of water. I came back to Carlos completely freaking out. The car window was smashed. The package was gone. That's when he told me what was inside. Cocaine. 5 kilos, worth $250,000. The package we just lost. I couldn't breathe. I kept yelling, "What did you do? What did you get us into?" Less than 2 hours later, they found us. 3 guys pulled up while we were still standing there, arguing at the gas station. Carlos knew them. They weren't police. They took us to a house in Chula Vista. They explained it very clearly. We owed them $250,000. We had 48 hours to bring the cash to Tijuana. If we didn't, they would kill us both. And then, they said, they would visit our families. They used your name, Mom. They knew the address of the restaurant. They described what Dad looked like. Don't go to the police, they said. We have people everywhere. We'll know, and everyone you love will die. I believed them. I was 22 years old and completely terrified. I knew where Dad kept the money. I knew the combination because he taught it to me. I knew exactly how much was there. I told myself I was protecting you both, that if I didn't pay them, they would kill all of us. I told myself I would pay it back somehow, work for the rest of my life, but at least you'd be alive. That night, I went to the restaurant, let myself in the back, opened the safe. All those envelopes, years of saving, Dad's careful handwriting on each one. I took all of it. I tried to close the safe, tried 3 times. My hands were shaking too badly. I left it open. The next day, Carlos and I drove to Tijuana. We met the men at a warehouse, handed over the cash. They counted it. Then they told us, "You two stay in Mexico. If you cross back into the States, we'll assume you talked to the police. Your families become problems." We were trapped. Stay in Mexico or get everyone killed. That afternoon, I called the restaurant to explain. The line was busy. Tried again. Busy. The 3rd time, a stranger answered. Said the restaurant was closed. An emergency. I found out 2 days later. Dad found the empty safe. Heart attack. Died in the hospital. I killed him, Mom. I emptied that safe, and his heart couldn't take the shock. He died, thinking I betrayed him, thinking I stole from my own family. How do you come back from that? How do you call and say, "Sorry I killed Dad, but I had a good reason"? I couldn't. I was a coward. I stayed in Tijuana, got a construction job, lived cheap, saved everything. I opened a safe, the one you saw today, and started filling it every week, labeled each stack with the year. I met Liana's mother, had Liana. The mother left. I raised Liana alone. The money I stole was always yours. I kept adding to it. I spent my whole life trying to pay back one terrible night. I'm sorry, Mom. Sorry I took the money. Sorry I ran. Sorry I was too afraid to face you. Sorry you had to lose your husband and your son in the same week. I love you. Always did. I wish I could have told Dad. I'm sorry. Esteban. I finished reading. My hands were shaking, and the pages were wet where my tears had fallen. I sat in the dark kitchen. The streetlight outside made everything look cold and strange. The tea I'd made was stone cold, untouched. The understanding didn't erase the pain, but it changed it. It became something different, something complicated and devastating. He hadn't been a greedy, heartless thief. He had been a terrified boy making a desperate, foolish choice to save his family, a choice that had cost his father's life and led to his own 25-year exile. I remembered the folder I had grabbed from the storage unit, the one I had taken just because I needed something to carry besides the letter. It was marked 2015. I opened it now on the kitchen table. The first paper was an eviction notice. My name, the address of an apartment I'd lived in years ago, 3 months behind on rent. The amount owed was circled in red, $2,400. The next paper was a wire transfer receipt from Tijuana, the same date as the eviction notice. The exact amount, $2,400, sent to my landlord's name. I remembered that time. It was maybe 10 years ago. I was working 2 jobs, but one cut my hours. I couldn't make the rent. The eviction notice came. 3 days later, my landlord called, confused. Said someone had paid my rent, all of it, plus the late fees. They wouldn't tell me who. I thought it was an accounting error, some kind of miracle. I'd been too tired and desperate to question it. It was Esteban. The next set of papers in the folder were medical bills from my appendectomy. I remembered that too. Woke up in the hospital, emergency surgery, no insurance. The bill was over $8,000. I'd cried looking at it, knowing I'd be paying it off for years. Then a nurse came in, said the bill had been covered. Anonymous donation to the hospital's charity fund, specifically marked for my account. I'd thought it was the hospital's program, a stroke of luck. I never questioned it. It was Esteban. More papers followed, a mechanic's receipt for a transmission repair for $1,200. My old car had died, and I couldn't afford to fix it and was preparing to sell it for parts. Then the mechanic called, said someone had already paid. Wouldn't say who. I remembered crying in that parking lot, thinking I had finally gotten lucky for once. It was Esteban. There were more lists of smaller transfers, always when I'd been between jobs or in some kind of crisis. Anonymous envelopes of cash that appeared in my mailbox with no return address, just enough to cover groceries, utilities, small emergencies. I'd thought some were from church charity, some from confused billing, some from simple luck. All of it was Esteban. He had been watching me for years, crossing the border, tracking my life, seeing when I struggled, sending money when he could, helping from the shadows. I spread all the evidence across my kitchen table, receipts, wire transfers, proof of anonymous help spanning over a decade. He had been following me, watching my life without my knowing. He stole everything, but he paid it back. And then some. He disappeared, but he never really left. He couldn't face me, but he never stopped trying to help. Both things were true at the same time. There was no clean way to resolve that contradiction. My phone buzzed. A text from Liana. Did you read it? I looked at the letter, the receipts, the wooden box with Antonio's watch in my lap. I texted back, yes. 3 dots appeared on the screen. Then can we talk tomorrow? Yes, I wrote. I knew what she wanted to ask. Can you forgive him? I didn't know the answer yet. I gathered all the papers, stacking them carefully next to the letter. Esteban had spent his entire adult life trying to atone for one terrified night when he was 22 years old. I had spent just as long hating him for abandoning me. Now I knew the truth. I just didn't know what to do with it. I met Liana the next morning at a small cafe near downtown, one of the newer, brighter places that felt miles away from the quiet gloom of my apartment. She was already there when I arrived, 2 coffees sitting on the table, a clear indication of a hopeful future. I slid into the booth across from her, the vinyl cold against my legs. Neither of us knew how to start. You read everything? She asked finally, her voice careful, fragile. Everything, I confirmed. The letter, the evidence, all of it. We both sipped our coffee. It was too hot, but I drank it anyway, needing the small distraction. Do you believe him? Liana asked, her voice hushed. I thought about it, running over the details of the letter in my mind, the clarity of the confession, the terror of a 22-year-old facing a cartel, the immediate consequence of his father's death. I believe it happened the way he said, I said, choosing my words carefully. I believe he was terrified, but I paused, the anger still bubbling under the surface. I'm still angry he didn't trust us enough to tell the truth. We could have faced the danger together, run, gone to the police, something. Liana nodded slowly, her expression sad. He said the same thing in the hospital, that his biggest mistake was thinking he had to handle it alone. When exactly did he tell you? I pressed, needing the timeline of his death to make sense of his confession. Liana put down her coffee mug. The last week. He'd been in the hospital for 5 days. They'd given him so much morphine he barely knew where he was most of the time. But one night, around 2 a.m, he woke up completely lucid. He grabbed my hand so hard it hurt. I could picture the scene perfectly, the harsh hospital lights, the steady beep of the machines, my son dying, finally forced to confront his truth. He told me everything that night, Liana continued, her eyes wet, about the cartel, about the money, about his father. He cried while he was talking, kept saying, I killed him. I killed my own father. A knot tightened in my chest. The hospital machine started to go crazy. Nurses rushed in. They pushed me out into the hallway. I waited there for 2 hours. Liana's voice cracked. The doctor came out and said his heart gave out, that his body was too weak from the cancer. Heart attack, I said quietly. The parallel, a vicious twist of fate. Yes, Liana whispered, just like Antonio. I know, she said, looking straight at me. He knew too. I think he expected it. We sat with that awful realization, both men, father and son, dying the same way. One from discovering the betrayal, the other from finally confessing it. The parallel was a cruel, poetic justice. Finally, Liana asked the question that had hung between us since she arrived. Can you forgive him? I looked out the cafe window at the people walking by, living their normal, uncomplicated lives. I watched them for a long time before answering. I don't know if forgiveness is the right word. What word would be right? I looked back at her. Understanding. Maybe acceptance. I watched my reflection in her eyes. I understand why he did it. I accept that he tried to make it right for 25 years. Is that enough? I saw Antonio's eyes looking back at me, my own jawline reflected in hers. It has to be, I decided. He's gone. I can't forgive him to his face. I can't yell at him. I can't hug him. I can't do anything except decide how to move forward. Liana's shoulders slumped slightly, the tension she had been carrying finally easing. Can I still visit you? She asked, a small tentative question. Even if you can't forgive him. I reached across the table and touched her hand briefly. You're not him, Liana. You're you. And yes, you can visit. The pain hadn't vanished, but the wound had finally begun to close, not with the clean snap of forgiveness, but with the slow, messy process of understanding. Over the next few weeks, Liana and I met regularly, sometimes at my apartment, sometimes at small coffee shops that reminded me of the quieter corners of El Sabor de Antonio. We didn't talk about the safe or the cartel. We talked about Esteban. We were trading fragments of a whole life, piecing together the man who existed between the greedy thief and the devoted father. I told her about Esteban as a little boy, how he'd loved helping in the restaurant kitchen, standing on a stool next to Antonio to watch him cook. I told her how his laugh used to fill the entire dining room, and how he'd been gentle with the stray cats that hung around the back door. Liana, in turn, told me about her father. She told me about him teaching her to ride a bike, his endless patience, and how he'd help her with math homework even when he was exhausted from the construction site. She described his Sunday morning ritual, making breakfast, The same recipes he'd learned with Antonio, comfort food passed across a border and a lifetime of silence. We were building something fragile but real, not a replacement for what was lost, but a new structure built on the ruins. I started to see my son not as a single act of betrayal, but as a man who made a terrible, terrifying choice and spent the rest of his life trying to undo the damage. Then I made a decision about the money, all of it. I moved the $356,000 from the safe in the storage unit to a bank account. For the first time in my life, I saw that many numbers after my name. It was the first time I felt truly safe in 25 years. The money wasn't a fortune, but it was stability. It was my future. I quit one of my bookkeeping clients and started working less. I had time to breathe, to simply sit without the constant pressure of making the next rent payment. I started with the small things, fixing the dripping faucet, the cabinet door that wouldn't close, small repairs I had put off for years because they cost money. Next, I bought a reliable car that didn't make concerning noises when I turned left. I started buying good coffee instead of the cheapest blend. I stopped checking prices at the grocery store. It was a slow, quiet reclaiming of dignity. The greatest change was the freedom from the grinding fear of poverty. I realized that my son, even in his guilt and absence, had ensured my survival. Every time I thought I was holding on by my own strength, he had been there, silently, anonymously, supporting me. Finally, I used a large portion of the money for a down payment on a small house, about 20 minutes from where I lived in Ocean Beach. 2 bedrooms, a small yard, in a safe neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. 1 bedroom for me and 1 for when Liana visited. I planted a garden, tomatoes, herbs, and flowers, things that grew, a stark contrast to the sterile cement life I'd been living. I set up a bank account for Liana for nursing school, for whatever she needed. The money would help her finish her education and start her life right. The act of providing for her felt like the final, most crucial step in accepting Esteban's redemption. The house was the promise of a future I thought I'd lost forever. One weekend, Liana offered to drive me to Tijuana. I hadn't crossed the border in decades. It felt like stepping back in time, or maybe stepping out of a lifetime of self-imposed exile. The sights and sounds were familiar, yet distant. Liana navigated the streets with confidence, driving through neighborhoods I didn't recognize until we reached a small, quiet cemetery on the edge of the city. Esteban was buried there, a simple headstone, weathered by the elements. It read, "Esteban Vega, beloved father." Liana stopped a little distance away, giving me my space. I stood at the grave alone. I hadn't prepared a speech. I hadn't rehearsed the words, but they came anyway, quiet and rough. "I read your letter, Esteban," I said, my voice barely audible above the distant sounds of traffic. "I know what happened now. I understand you were scared." A bird sang somewhere nearby. "But you should have told us. We could have faced it together. You didn't have to carry it alone." I paused, the words catching in my throat. "You carried it alone for all those years," I continued, looking down at his name carved in the stone. "That was your choice. I spent just as long being angry. That was mine. My son, gone before I could ever see him again, hug him, or simply look him in the eye. I can't say I forgive you," I admitted. "That feels too simple for something this complicated, but I accept what you did. The stealing and the paying back, the running and the watching, all of it." I knelt down, brushing some dirt off the stone. "You raised a good daughter, Esteban," I said, looking toward Liana, standing quietly under a tree. "She's smart, kind, and strong. You did that right. Antonio would have liked her. He would have been proud of her." I stopped, a small, reluctant realization dawning. Maybe he would have been proud of you for that part, too. I placed the small, bright bouquet of flowers I had brought from a local market against the gray stone. The simple act felt more meaningful than any grand declaration. Liana drove us back to San Diego. We didn't talk much during the drive. Some things don't need words. Back home, I finally hung photos on my living room wall. I found one of Esteban when he was maybe 20, before everything fell apart. He was smiling, standing in the restaurant in his apron, holding a tray. Next to it, I hung Liana's high school graduation photo, cap and gown holding her diploma. Same smile. Family continuing. Different than before, but continuing. The journey was not about erasing the past, but making room for the truth it contained. With the ghost of Esteban's guilt finally laid to rest, a new, gentle rhythm took hold of my life. Liana became a steady, comforting presence. She visited every few weeks, and we'd cook together in my new kitchen. I began teaching her how to make tamales, the way Antonio had taught me, the same recipes, the same motions, a direct line back to the life that had been stolen. I showed her how to spread the masa, how to fold the corn husks just right, and how to get the filling perfectly seasoned. She took notes on her phone, asked sharp, specific questions, and learned quickly. We didn't talk about Esteban constantly, but he was everywhere, in the silver watch Antonio gave him, which I kept on my dresser, in Liana's laugh, which sounded exactly like his, in the simple, quiet freedom the money provided me. He was no longer a shadow of betrayal, but a complicated memory of love and tragedy. My focus shifted from survival to living. I started volunteering more at the library, enjoying the simple company and the intellectual stimulation. I used my bookkeeping skills to help a few local charities, feeling useful in a way that my previous frantic employment never allowed. The financial stability didn't just buy me a house and a reliable car. It bought me back my time and my dignity. It allowed me to look people in the eye again, not as the woman whose life was ruined, but as Isadora Vega, a woman with a future. One afternoon, I was cleaning out some old boxes from the apartment, boxes I hadn't opened in 25 years. I found a small leather-bound notebook, Antonio's old ledger for the restaurant. I sat down and flipped through it. His precise, slightly flourishing script detailed every order, every cost, every weekly deposit into the safe. On the page dated the day before Esteban left, there was a small note I had never noticed, written under the final deposit. I feel an unease. Esteban seems distracted. Need to talk to him about the combination. Maybe it's time for him to share the weight of our future. The note chilled me. Antonio hadn't just died from the shock of the empty safe. He died with a sudden growing fear about his son. He had sensed the tension, the distraction, the wrong choice that was about to be made. My son's terrible mistake was an act of terror, but his father's death was a culmination of fear, shock, and a lifetime of high blood pressure that he refused to acknowledge. The truth wasn't a single, clean fact. It was a devastating storm of bad choices, silent burdens, and awful timing. The discovery didn't make me forgive Esteban, but it deepened my acceptance. He had been carrying a weight Antonio was already worried about. Liana was flourishing. The stability and the quiet support allowed her to focus entirely on her nursing studies. She was sharp, empathetic, and driven, qualities that would make her an excellent nurse. She embodied the best of Esteban's character, his loyalty, his determination, and his quiet strength. I realized that my most important task now was not to mourn the past, but to ensure her future. One evening, Liana came over to my new house, excited about a hospital placement she had just secured in a different part of San Diego. It was a long commute from her current place, and she was worried about balancing work, school, and the drive. I looked at her, then out at my blooming garden, the tomatoes already turning red, the basil heavy with scent. I had everything I needed. "The house has 2 bedrooms, Liana," I said quietly, making the decision I'd been contemplating for months. "And the second bedroom is completely empty. Why don't you move in?" She looked stunned, tears immediately welling up in her hazel eyes. "Abuela." I couldn't. I would love to, but I can pay rent. "No," I interrupted gently. "You don't need to pay rent. You need to focus on your studies. Your father, Esteban spent his life saving that money to give us all a second chance. This house, your education, your career. That is the only way to truly honor his sacrifice. This is his final payment." Her silence was thick with emotion. She finally came around the table and wrapped her arms around me, holding me tight. It was the first time she had hugged me, and the embrace felt like the missing piece of the puzzle, a physical connection to the son I had lost. She moved in a week later. The house suddenly felt full of life. Her energy and dedication were infectious. I taught her how to tend the garden, and we spent hours talking, not about the past, but about the future. I helped her with her anatomy studies, putting my old bookkeeping logic to use on charts and diagrams. I was finally fulfilling Antonio's last words to Esteban. You need to be able to take care of your mother. In a strange, beautiful twist of fate, Esteban had ensured that I would take care of his daughter. One night, as we were washing dishes, Liana looked at me and smiled. Antonio's smile passed down through Esteban. Thank you, Abuela Isadora, she said simply, for everything. I should thank you, I replied, drying my hands. You brought me the truth. You brought me back to my life. I thought about the cold, small key, the trigger for this entire chaotic rebirth. It hadn't just unlocked a safe. It had unlocked my heart. I wasn't the bitter, closed-off woman who lived only to remember a betrayal. I was a grandmother, a homeowner, a survivor, with a second chance at family. My best chapter, the one Antonio always said was coming, had finally begun. A year passed. Liana graduated from nursing school, passing her exams with flying colors. I was there, sitting in the front row, watching her accept her diploma. She was radiant, wearing a small silver necklace I had bought her, a simple key charm. She looked straight at me, her eyes glistening, and mouthed, "Thank you." In that moment, the final sharp edges of my anger toward Esteban finally melted away. He may have made a choice that killed his father, but he also made a choice that saved his daughter and ultimately saved me. His redemption was not in the money, but in the life he gave Liana. She accepted a job at a major hospital in San Diego. The second bedroom was now her sanctuary, filled with books and nursing equipment, the walls covered with photos of her and her father, now placed next to the old photograph of the three of us in front of the restaurant. We were a family again, imperfect, scarred, but whole. I realized that I had moved beyond mere acceptance. I finally understood the heart of a man who would rather carry a lie and suffer for a lifetime than risk the death of his loved ones. One evening, Liana and I were in the kitchen, making tamales for the upcoming holiday. The masa was spread out, the music was soft, and our hands were moving in familiar, comforting unison. I watched her work, careful, focused, and steady. I saw 3 generations in her face, Antonio's kind eyes, Esteban's determined jawline, and something of my own resilience in the way she moved. I thought about Esteban at 22, making that desperate choice in a moment of terror. I thought about Antonio dying before he knew the whole truth, and I thought about myself, surviving alone, not as alone as I had believed. Liana, I said quietly, without looking up from my work. I have to tell you something. She paused, her hand still. I don't know if this is forgiveness, I continued, folding a corn husk just right. But it's peace. He paid back every penny. He watched over me when I didn't know. He raised you to be kind. That counts for more than anything else. Liana looked up, and the smile that broke across her face was pure Antonio, pure Esteban, and purely her own. I know, Abuela, she whispered. I always knew he tried. Outside my kitchen window, the garden I had planted was in full bloom. The small green shoots I had started were now mature, vibrant plants, growing toward the light. We kept working, hands moving in the familiar rhythm, making something together, building a new, strong foundation from everything that had been broken. The story wasn't one of pure tragedy, but of a winding, painful path to unexpected justice and healing. The son who ran saved the mother he left behind, and the granddaughter brought them back together, a new life blooming from the soil of the past. So, that's my story. I'd love to hear what you think. If you were in my place, could you have found peace with Esteban after learning the whole truth? Let me know in the comments and subscribe for more stories like mine.